Hello there. Right, now for a little charcoal tutorial before you start any of your apples and pears drawings. This is going to be really helpful if you've never used these materials. Now you'll see I've got two different types of charcoal here. We've got willow charcoal and this is Pitt Charcoal, sometimes called compressed charcoal as well. Now I'm just going to show you the difference between the two and explain why we're going to be using the willow charcoal. Now, compressed charcoal or Pitt charcoal is much more solid a material, and you might be able to see that there's a material stamp which is down the side. I mean, they're manufactured in a very different way. It's a little bit like a hard pastel. Now, this Pitt charcoal gives an amazingly strong black line. It's almost like a crayon in some cases, except it's not waxy at all. And you see when you smudge it, the original line remains really strong and very black indeed. So this is incredible to use for mixed media or any time that you're feeling very confident about your charcoal work and you want to get very strong dark marks. Now the downside of this is that it's actually really hard to rub out, and of course when you're trying to brush away the little bits of rubbing, you get smudge charcoal all over the place. So this is why I always encourage students to use the willow charcoal to start with. Now it's available in all sorts of different forms, but it's always called willow charcoal. I think I might even have seen it called twig charcoal. And you can tell, I mean, it's a completely different look from the very hard pastel look to something which quite frankly resembles a twig or a stick. And if you look at them really closely, you can even see little markings like it is an actual branch. Now, if I show you this next to the Pitt charcoal, you see how straight away it's a lot more grey, and when I smudge it, it comes off very easily. Now that can be a little bit of frustration when you're starting to learn because you want to retain the marks that you've made, but actually it's a really good material to learn with because it does allow you to make corrections to your drawing very easily. Now the one thing that I want to point out now, which is very important with the charcoal, and this is that when you draw a line with it, even when you then try and smudge the line or rub it out, and here I'm going to use the putty rubber, and I'll just talk about the putty rubber a little bit more in a second. But you see, when I rub that out, most of the charcoal where I smudged with my finger comes off, but that line, that original drawn line, is still there. So the charcoal, whoop, come back, doesn't want to be drawn with. The charcoal itself leaves a scar on the paper, and that's why it's really important when you're starting to learn with charcoal that you do the pencil drawing first. And when I say pencil drawing, I really mean just doing the outline, the edge of your drawing. Never shade in with pencil if you're then going to be using charcoal over the top. One of the reasons for that is that charcoal is a very matte material. You can see that it doesn't have any shine to it. Now graphite, which is used in pencils, is metallic. So the two don't really combine very well. You can see that the charcoal has a little bit of trouble sticking over the top of the graphite pencil. But also, if I smudge that, and there are some areas of the graphite still showing through, when it moves around in different lights, you're going to get a tiny bit of reflection from the graphite, and the charcoal is going to stand out and the graphite pencil is going to look very different. I don't know whether you can see that, but there's some real shine coming from the pencil there where I haven't covered it, and it just creates quite a competing sort of mixed media look, which is not what we're after just for the charcoal drawings here. Now, when you're using the pencil to create your shapes before doing the charcoal drawing, it is important just to remember that you're simply creating a shape which is a guideline for the charcoal. And this is really important to remember, that the charcoal leaves a scar on the paper. Okay, so wherever you actually draw with it, it's not going to come off. It's always going to leave a little memory of where it was. So being able to confidently draw where you want the charcoal to go and then smudge it from there, that's really, really important, to just do your preparation in advance, so you don't get the frustration of constantly having to see all of those lines where you normally would be rubbing them out with a pencil and being able to correct and start again. Now, there are two different ways to use the charcoal. One is to draw directly on with it, and the other is to smudge it. Now, I'm going to show you with an exercise directly related to the apples and pears from the first drawing. So I'm actually just going to now show you what it might look like if we were going to use this charcoal directly in this pear exercise, apples and pears exercise. So here we have one of the pears from the photograph that I'm demonstrating with. And of course, remember the shadow on the table. Very, very, very important. Now, you may have printed out the photograph, or you may be able to remember what it looks like, but there's very strong shading all down this left-hand side. Now, when I've plotted out the picture like this, so I know where the charcoal is going to go, this is now my road map for the guidelines of where the charcoal is going to go. So I know about the scar, but I also know that this side of the object is very, very dark, so I can confidently draw directly on, even though I know that this is going to leave a line, because this is where one of the darkest areas of the object lies. So here, now I'm just using the charcoal, filling this in. Oh yeah, sometimes it does actually talk to you and you get a little bit of a squeak, which is relatively unpleasant. But if you're in a, oh, see, I'm laughing and blowing little bits of it all over the paper. But hopefully there won't be anybody nearby to hear it screeching on the paper. So I know that this is a very dark area, and I'm confidently putting in lots and lots of charcoal there. And I also, straight away, I'm going to start building in the shadow area by creating the edges of the shadow there. Now, all of these marks I can confidently put down because I've done the drawing ahead of time. Now, this is where it starts to get really interesting, and charcoal is such a quick way to create really realistic, strong shading. Now, you can see I'm just taking it from the dark areas of shadow and smudging it over into the lighter area of the objects with my finger. Now, there are all sorts of different tools you can buy which help you smudge charcoal without getting too dirty. I mean, one of them, you can actually use a cotton bud, which can give a lovely, lovely soft blend like that. You can also buy all kinds of cardboard tubes in shapes of pencils, and they're actually called shapers or smudgers. And these work very, very well for getting, see how much charcoal is coming off there. They work very well for getting detailed areas of the charcoal smudged. But you can also just cut a piece of cardboard. This is from the back of a sketchbook. And that can also help to draw and direct the charcoal in very specific ways. So you don't actually have to spend lots of money on tools if you don't have the tools already. So when I've moved the charcoal over from the really, really dark area of the object over here, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to smudge all of this in and show you how to use the putty rubber to get those incredible areas of texture down the center of the pear. Remember from the introduction when I was talking about the most important area of the object being where the light meets the shade, and right down the center it shows the texture. And I'm also going to build in this really dark area of shadow underneath here and smudge that sideways. Now, what you might find, you see what's happening with this willow charcoal, it's quite loose, quite soft. See how it's now coming away from the pear as I'm smudging it, and a lot of it's going onto my finger and some of it's going onto the paper. Now, of course, that completely changes the look of the drawing because I'm taking that whole shape of shadow over to the left and it's interrupted the flow of my pear bulge here. So what you want to keep doing, and you'll find you have to do this a lot with the willow charcoal because it is very light and very smudgeable. I'm just going to keep replenishing all of those dark areas, keep adding in the black, and see how dark that looked before I added on this extra charcoal. See, so much of it had already been moved. And don't worry about all the little bits that you get on your paper. You can just blow them away at the end and they're not going to leave little marks. And if they do, you can rub them away. Because remember, the only places where it leaves a permanent mark are where you actually draw with it. So I can just keep replenishing all the areas where I think that there needs to be additional dark shadow. And definitely along here, I can remember from the photograph, it's very dark in this section. Just keep adding it on top. After a while, the charcoal will get saturated. You can see where it starts flaking off. And that's where you know that you can't make it any more dark. Now this is one of the issues that I think a lot of people have with charcoal when they first start, is the sense that it feels very messy and you can't get detail. Well, actually, even just from filling in some of these areas, do you see how much of a point has been created on the end of the charcoal stick there? One thing which can be really helpful is to have a scrap piece of paper where you actually create a little reservoir of charcoal that you can dip your finger into and use on the picture like this. So getting a little bit of, you probably do this on a separate piece, not on your drawing. And you see how I can add in a little bit of texture just by dabbing on with my finger, but it also serves as a really good way to sharpen the charcoal because it can be very, very soft. And then it makes really easy to draw very, very, very fine lines. You see, that's an incredibly fine line for a very thick seaming material. Okay, so just a little bit of dark down there. So remember, this is just to show you how to use the charcoal and how to apply it and the different ways. Now, as you can tell from my fingers, I actually find it really comfortable just to use my finger. Sometimes I use my little finger because it's much smaller, but you'll probably find your index or your middle fingers, those are the ones that feel like they've got the most control. Okay, now at the moment that's very grey and it's definitely a pear shape, but I want it to look really realistic. And this is where the putty rubber comes in. Now these are amazing. Sometimes they're called kneadable erasers, but if you don't have one of these, to be honest, a bit of Blu-Tac works just as well. See the consistency of it? It's incredible. Now, you know how with normal school rubbers or any kind of standard plastic rubber, when you rub onto the paper, the reason why it removes the marks is because, of course, bits come off. Now, you know this because you'll have spent many times drawing where you're rubbing off the bits of eraser that have come onto the paper. Now, of course, you don't want to do that over your charcoal drawing because when you're brushing off all the little bits, you're going to smudge the drawing, aren't you? You know, if I was brushing this off, I then create a great deal of charcoal all over my drawing. Now, these are designed specifically for very smudgeable, oh, put my finger in it, not very aware of my distances there. That doesn't matter at all. These are so clever because they actually absorb all of the material. They absorb the charcoal into them rather than parts of this coming off. So you can create very detailed drawings by using this to clean up edges. And they're incredibly helpful for textural effects as well. Now, one of the things I want to point out with these is don't fall into the trap of thinking that to have really specific detail using the rubber, that you have to have a very fine point. Because they're very soft, that is what happens straight away. And that's not going to do anybody any good. So I always say to my students, think about creating a relatively solid shape at one end. Now, either a spatula shape, or depending on your mood, an axe blade, but let's call it a spatula today. So you see how I've got a very, very solid shape there. So now when I'm rubbing with that, I've got a good piece to hold on to, and it's not going to lose its shape, and that allows me to actually draw in. So you can draw in and create very specific lines, which is just amazing. So you see on the rubber how that has now taken up all of the charcoal. All you need to do is just fold it over and keep going. And not only does it allow you to draw specific lines, so maybe this side of the pear needed to be a lot lighter. Now you see, even using the putty rubber along here, where I've smudged with my finger, there's still the shadow of the charcoal there. So if you want an area to be really, really bright, try and leave it as white paper. I'm just going to soften the edge there, and just to show you a different technique. Now when we're dealing with the pear, which is quite lumpy and round, I'm going to create that shape with the edge of my putty rubber. Now, one of the techniques I use is very simple. I just call it press and lift. So you can press down and lift off, and you see instantly it takes off a whole layer of the charcoal. And if I don't fold that over and I just keep pressing and lifting all the way up, what happens, you see that line there where I rubbed out earlier, that line stays, but it just lifts off a whole layer of the charcoal. So here, if you had a lot of detail, but it just looked too dark, you can just press and lift with your putty rubber. The detail will remain the same, but the whole picture gets a little bit lighter. Now I know from the drawing, from the photograph rather, that it's much, much, much lighter on this side. So I'm going to use just an edge, and you can rub really quite hard with this. When you've got a good solid shape, it's not going to go anywhere. And I'm just going to take this back to nice and bright. I want to have a very, very strong contrast between the two sides. Now to get that texture, you can see with where I was pressing and lifting along here, it's already starting to look a little bit lumpy, but that's far too formal a shape. You don't want to create a pattern, because our eye loves to see a pattern. So what I'm doing is I'm twisting. I'm just twisting like that, twisting and pressing. And this allows it with different pressures, twisting and pressing through a little bit of fast movement like that, through here, a bit of dotting, bit of dabbing. You see how that starts to create this amazing line which shows the lumpy texture of the pear. Remember how I said that the most important part is where the light meets the dark along here. That describes the texture as the shape changes and the light just catches the top of each of those lumps. Now what you'll find when you're doing a lot of drawing is that you'll have a conversation between light and dark, and I use that expression a lot because you might take off a little bit too much of the charcoal and need to put some back on. Then you will put on too much charcoal and need to rub a little bit of it out, and that is absolutely fine. It's working with the material until you get the balance that you want. So perhaps I'm just going to create a little bit more dotty texture along here. Now, of course, this method applies to any kind of drawing that you're doing. I'm just showing you with the pear because it's something that we're going to be focusing on, and to show you how the charcoal can work. Now, what if I do something like this? And I have a lot of people saying their fingers just feel too fat for doing charcoal, and you do something like that, you've got a nice fine shape and you just ruin it in your eyes by smudging too much. You'll just take your putty rubber and you can just clean around it. So in fact, this becomes a little bit like, oh, look, you can see how where my finger has been dipping in the charcoal reservoir. I've now left really interesting prints over there. You become very aware of your body when you're drawing, with the bits that smudge and the bits that ruin your drawing and the bits that make it all better. So you see how I can just clean that up with the putty rubber, make the space nice and tidy again. And then, because I want to have a very strong line of dark under there once more, I'm just going to come back in and just draw nice and delicately there. So nothing is ever lost when you're using charcoal. And just remember, Always to think about that conversation between light and dark. Now I'm just going to blow away all those little bits, and now I can clean up this side. Now, of course, in the actual drawing, there's plenty more going on. In the picture, there's all sorts of other objects around. See how easy it is to rub off the charcoal with the putty rubber. And of course, you can still use the school eraser or your plastic eraser, but just be really aware of the little bits and make sure that when you've got clean hands when you're rubbing away those little bits of eraser. Okay, so now we have quite an interesting image already forming. How quick was that? You've only got a tiny little bit of mess to clean up and a very, very realistic looking shape from just a few motions of putting on the very, very dark charcoal on one side and basically rubbing it off, creating that textured look down the center. Isn't that fun? On to the next thing. Bye-bye.